Hello to anyone viewing. Just to start off here, my name is Justin Steele, and I run the blog, the Arkham Digest. And with me today is Joe Pulver, Sr. Hi, Joe. How you doing?
Hi, Justin. How are you?
Doing pretty good. And Joe here is an author-editor, and you have, I think, 2 novels and 3 short story collections as of now.
Currently. Yes, currently.
And 2 anthologies that you have recently edited with Miskatonic River Press, and a few upcoming ones as well.
That's correct.
And Joe is with me here today to talk about Robert Chambers and the King in Yellow. Lately, it's been kind of popping up all over the place. HBO show True Detective has been kind of, putting a lot of spotlight on these stories. And there's many people out there who don't really know much about it and are curious. So, Joe and I were talking and thought it would be good to get together, kind of do a little, primer about the entire King in Yellow mythos. Joe himself is probably the most knowledgeable person about the King in Yellow mythos today. How many stories have you written, Joe? King in Yellow stories?
Published nearly 40, and there's a novella and a few other things that'll be in my next 2 collections, which Jeff Thomas and I are editing as we speak. So I'm probably up around 45 at the moment.
That's a pretty good number too. And then one of the anthologies Joe has recently edited is The Season of Carcosa, which is, do you want to tell them what it is, Joe?
It's a collection of all new tales based on or in tribute to the work of Robert W. Chambers, specifically The King in Yellow, or what some people may be calling the Carcosa mythos.
Cool. So for everyone out there watching, probably the first question many of them have is, what is the King in Yellow?
Right. And it's 3 things, and we'll take them one at a time. Number 1, it's a book, which came out in 1895. Was written by Robert W. Chambers. And let's see if I can hold this up so people can see one of the classic covers. This is the Ace edition, which back in the day cost 45 cents. There are other weird fiction tales in this volume as well, but there are the first 4 stories, which are The Repairer of Reputations, The Mask, The Court of the Dragon, and The Yellow Sign. Those 4 tales are the core. They are the initial canon that everything else is based upon. And as we're doing this, because people are just getting into the King in Yellow, some people, due to True Detective, anyone who wants to go all the way back to Chambers to get an idea of the King in Yellow, the Kindle version is like 99 cents. There's also a free version for Kindle, and I believe it's Project Gutenberg has all these stories online they could read for free. And I would recommend people read the Yellow Sign first. It's short, it's concise, it's brilliant, and it perhaps is most palatable for a contemporary reader. I think all 4 core tales are essential, but the King in Yellow is the one to start with. For people who want to get a sense of what's behind the curtain here in True Detective.
That was actually my first King in Yellow story was The Yellow Sign, so that was pretty appropriate, I would say.
Yeah, a lot of people discover Chambers through that story because it's been highly anthologized over the decades. And later when we talk about where I discovered Chambers, that'll come up again. So that's what it is. It's a book with 4 stories. These are vaguely connected stories. in some ways we can look at them the way we look at Lovecraft's early pseudo-mythology building. The stories are vaguely connected, but not, a piece of this and a piece of that. So, in common, these stories have a monstrous and suppressed book, okay, I play, which is called The King in Yellow, and perusing that play instills fright, madness, spectral tragedy. Lovecraft himself, when he finally got around to reading The King in Yellow, which was 1927, it was late, said that Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow really achieves notable heights of cosmic fear. So, the King in Yellow is weird, classic weird fiction to me. Most people deem it horror, but there are those who would see it as a particularly fine example of Victorian Gothic literature. And if we look at those four core tales, and just those, these are salted with nihilism and ennui. They are absolutely ripe with derangement, haunting beauty, and eerie torments. Poe's influence is present. That's obvious to anyone who reads the four tales. And it's very easy to lay it out for people that they'd be able to see the influence of the French decadence and the symbiosts. And we have to remember that Chambers, as a young man, spent a number of years in Paris at the Beaux-Arts studying painting. So, the influence of the French is huge in the King in Yellow work. And that's the first part. The book is the first part. The second part of what is the King in Yellow is it's a play. Chambers gives us brief quotes from it, scenes from it, but he never writes the whole play because Chambers' viewpoint is if this thing truly instills derangement and madness, well, how could he write something that would do that to the reader? So he just gives us these little bits and pieces to wonder about, question, and upon reading the play or viewing it, should it be, staged, what happens is, you can have any number of things. It can induce fits of nerves. It can result in enfeeblement. You can have stinging hallucinations. You can, violent hysteria, suicidal despondency. Everyone who reads the play falls under its spell, and they lose their grasp of reality, most often with calamitous consequences. I mean, in essence, they read it and they go mad. So that's part 2 of what the King in Yellow is. The third part of what the King in Yellow is, it is a character in the tale and in the play. And it involves a hidden king who visually resembles a human. He's clad in pale robes of scalloped tatters. He's winged and he wears a pallid mask. And those 3 things are what the King in Yellow is.
Now, the Yellow Sign, one of the stories, and another thing you see in a lot of, the fiction that has to do, based on the King in Yellow, involves this yellow sign. What is the yellow sign? I mean, do we know?
Yep, okay. Chambers never fully describes its shape or its purpose. Okay? What he does say is, quote unquote, a curious symbol or letter in gold. It was neither Arabic or Chinese, nor, as I found afterward, did it belong to any human script. In the first King in Yellow story, The Repair of Reputations, is where we get our first hint that anyone who sees it or possesses the sign, even accidentally, if you brush up against it, if it was on the cover of a book and you just turned and gazed on it momentarily, then it would exert some mind control and or possession. So it is perhaps a harbinger of the coming king. And that's most often, excuse me, the interpretation that by receiving the yellow sign, you are being opened up to receive the king. But Chambers, like I said, Chambers never describes it. The most common yellow sign out there was designed a number of years ago by Kevin Ross. He designed it for a Chaosium called the Cthulhu role-playing game. Ironically enough, when Chaosium printed the yellow sign, they got it wrong. They printed it upside down and backwards. So it's not really Kevin's interpretation of the yellow sign. But it has, in Lovecraftian circles, in Chambers circles, in weird fiction circles, Kevin Ross's yellow sign has become the de facto logo, emblem for the King in Yellow. But, you know, again, we don't really know what the yellow sign is.
One thing I've seen a lot of recently, you know, how I said it's getting a lot of outside popularity because of the True Detective, and in a lot of these big articles I've read, some people, there seems to be a common misconception that, you know, the King in Yellow has kind of been one of Lovecraft's biggest influence. You know, I mean, we know he read it, we know he liked it, but you know,
yes,
a lot of these articles kind of, you know, are making it seem like Chambers' King in Yellow had a much bigger influence on Lovecraft and his, you know, Cthulhu mythos, and I mean, that's not exactly true, is it?
No, it is not at all. In fact, Chambers' King in Yellow had absolutely no influence on Lovecraft's pseudo-mythology, or what's considered the Cthulhu mythos. Lovecraft begins forming his pseudo-mythology early. The first mention by Lovecraft of the Necronomicon is in The Hound, which was written in 1922. Lovecraft did not read Chambers until 27. I mean, we know this, ST's discovered this from Lovecraft's letters. So Lovecraft has a good 5 years of beginning to build his pseudo-mythology before he even reads The King in Yellow. One aside here is Chambers has a story called The Harbor Master, and Lovecraft had read that previous to The Hound. And the Harbor Master has a race of creatures that, if one looks to the shadow over Innsmouth, the deep ones below Devil's Reef and Chambers' creatures in the Harbor Master are very similar. So Chambers' one story, which has nothing to do with the King in Yellow, I would argue has some influence on Lovecraft. But the King in Yellow, absolutely none. Later on, after 27, after Lovecraft had read Chambers, he does, in a couple of tales, mention the King in Yellow by name and Carcosa by name. But me, St. Joshi, a few other people, we all see these as tips of the hat towards Chambers. You know, just HPL mentioning something he really liked. There's no real attempt to concretely weave these into the mythology that he may or may not have been building at that particular point. The next part of what you were discussing is August Derleth. Now, in modern gaming, in modern Lovecraftian fiction, the King in Yellow and Carcosa are part of the Cthulhu mythos. But not because of Lovecraft. August Derleth, who was young and a big fan of Lovecraft, proposed to Lovecraft that this pseudo-mythology that was being slowly constructed be, let's say, codified. And Derleth wanted to call it the Hastur mythos. And Derleth wanted to make Hastur, a great old one, instead of the lake that it is in Chambers. Lovecraft wanted to bring the King in Yellow and Carcosa directly into the mythos. And indeed, Derleth did utilize these things. He didn't have to worry about copyright or anything at that point. So in Derleth's Cthulhu mythos stories, we see the King in Yellow, Hastur, and Carcosa become things they absolutely were not in Chambers. And as time went by, with Derleth controlling the work of H.P. Lovecraft for so long, these things became accepted fact. And then when gaming came along, and it's not a bad thing. The gamers seem to really enjoy the King in Yellow and Carcosa and whatnot for scenarios. So they added to and expanded on the King in Yellow and Carcosa in the realm of role-playing games. I myself don't accept any of this. I want my chambers pure. I do not want tentacles with my King in Yellow. And the other thing is what Derleth wanted. Derleth wanted to, we'll be nice and say include, rather than I'd say hijack, the King in Yellow. And the King in Yellow would become a moon circling the Cthulhu mythos. Whereas I want the King in Yellow to be its own sun. I don't want it some little oddity circling something else. The other thing is, Derleth has the King in Yellow as perhaps an avatar of Hastur, or maybe even Nyarlathotep. Absolutely not, ladies and gentlemen, please. I mean, no. So that's where a lot of contemporary Lovecraft fans think that, oh, King in Yellow, yeah, Lovecraft started that. He didn't. He didn't include it. It's just completely false. And a lot of these magazine articles at this point that are starting to pop out, they don't know this. They haven't delved deep enough. It appears that the King in Yellow is part of the Lovecraft pseudo-mythology, so they just accept that as fact, which is erroneous.
This talking about how Derleth kind of came to include it, kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to ask is, I mean, there's been so much added, to this kind of King in Yellow,
right,
over the age, like over the, decades.
Decades,
so,
yeah.
It starts with Chamber, and then, like you said, didn't really influence Lovecraft. It was more Derleth who kind of tried to pull it into his version of Lovecraft's mythos. And how else has it kind of been changed, used, added on to over the decades?
If we run two tracks here, if we run pure Chambers, okay, and we'll do that one first. The pure Chambers track it begins with Chambers. Vincent Starrett in Weird Tales wrote a wonderful poem. Then we have to skip all the way to Wagner, Carl Edgar Wagner, if we're staying on the pure Chambers track.
Yes.
And interesting enough, if we stay on the pure Chambers track, Wagner, who has two of the absolute finest King in Yellow stories, one is the River of Night's Dreaming, which I'll talk about again in a bit, and I've come to talk to you today. They are King in Yellow canon, and they add nothing. He answers no questions. He does not codify. He doesn't fill any blanks. He does, Wagner, does exactly what Chambers does. He examines madness. He examines this presence being introduced to his characters. He uses the same elements approximately and retains all the mystery. When you come away from Wagner, it's the same way you do when you come away from Chambers. You're enthralled and you don't have any answers. And Wagner's tales, much like Chambers' The Yellow Sign, I also think would be very palatable for contemporary readers. The River a Night's Dreaming is one of my very favorite horror stories, period. No less than Peter Straub in, do I have it here? Yes, I do. In the introduction, let me move my camera, please. Sorry. In the introduction to Carl Wagner's In a Lonely Place anthology, says that The River a Night's Dreaming is one of the finest weird fiction tales written in the latter half of the 20th century. And that's Peter Straub, ladies and gentlemen, who sadly hasn't written a King Yellow Tale. Dear Mr. Straub, please. I'll start a Kickstarter for money for you. So if we're staying on that Chambers track, okay, we go to Wagner, and then we'll go to here. And this sort of has a story behind it, which I will relate. This is Peter Worthy's anthology of King and Yellow stories. It's called Rehearsals for Oblivion. Now, in '97, we were sitting in my backyard at the pool, and I said to Bob Price, who was doing a lot of Chaosium anthologies at that point, we need a new Chambers anthology. And Bob's like, And I said, come on. And he's like, I'll tell you what, we'll call it The Pallid Mask, and you edit it with me. I said, okay. So we began collecting stories. Chaosium agreed to it. And at the same time, I was friends with Peter Worthy. In England, Peter Worthy was doing a zine called Al-Aziz. And Peter's a big King in Yellow fan and said, I want to do an all King in Yellow issue. And I mentioned that in passing to Bob, and he said, Chaosium loves reprints. So we agreed, because it was going to be such a small run in England, that Peter Worthy could have some of these stories. Well, as Peter Worthy was starting to put them in a file, Chaosium had some financial problems, and the Pallid Mask fell apart. So most of the things that I had collected for the Pallid Mask, which, wound up in here. And there are quite a number of tales in here which stay on the Chambers track, which is, working with the King in Yellow, with Carcosa, with the characters in the play, without adding to it, without filling in anything, without codifying. And at the same time, I'm writing King in Yellow stuff. So I am the next step in that Chambers track. As much as I have written, like I said, almost 40 published tales at this point, I have added a couple of small things, one to do with Casilda and one to do with a specific locale in Carcosa. But I've never explained them. If you read my collected King in Yellow stuff, you'll come away the exact same way you'll come away from Chambers stuff. Got a lot of questions. There's a lot of mystery. I do not want the King in Yellow, as I said before, codified. I don't, Lumley and Carter and Derleth took Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, and they filled it in. They codified it. She's the daughter of this, who's the great niece of that great old one. And there are 332 steps before you take the left to enter this temple. I don't want that in Chambers. Now the other track is Derelith. Derelith writes a number of works that include the King in Yellow, and there are those who take up Derelith's torch and continue along those lines. And I'm not a fan of those. Some of them are well written and they're interesting, but it's a completely different King in Yellow, a completely different Carcosa, and I don't enjoy it, you know. And to this day, we have those two tracks running. The Chambers, for lack of a better word, purist, and then there are a lot of people who are writing King in Yellow material that has no problem accepting all those Derelithian ideas.
You know, for something that has so much, you know, the mystery is such a huge part of the King in Yellow that, you know, to me, when you codify it, you kill all the mystery, the menace. It's just, you know, I mean, I'm not saying that some of those stories, you know, aren't fun, but it's just not nearly the same, you know.
Yeah, again, some of the stories that utilize Derelithian elements are really wonderful. But when I talk about the King in Yellow canon, I talk about it in a sense of pure Chambers. What it was, you know, what it was then, what Wagner continued it with. And there's the big thing to me. Carl Wagner was the Chambers heir. I mean, Derelith tried to hijack the King in Yellow and ultimately did. Wagner returned it to Cosmic Horror. Wagner went back to Chambers and picked the ball up there and continued it without tarnishing it. His respect for Chambers was vast. Matter of fact, he had a publishing house that he called Carcosa Press. So there's nothing wrong with the Derelithian stuff. It's just absolutely not my cup of tea. You know, some of those Derelithian tales that have been written are quite candidly horrible. Some of them are quite good. But again, when I'm designing a King in Yellow canon, I don't include them because of my tastes. Someone who with a different taste, hardcore Lovecraftian fans who do accept Derelithian elements may well love these. They could have a completely different canon than mine. And they're welcome to it because it's just a matter of taste.
This kind of brings another question up. Carcosa was the name of Carl Edgar Wagner's press. And your, you know, latest King in Yellow anthology, A Season in Carcosa. Now, what exactly is Carcosa? It's a place, right?
It's a realm. Yes, it's a realm or an alternate reality. It's a fantastical city that sits on a shore where Chambers says where the cloud waves break. Now, he never describes what the cloud waves are. And above it, the black stars of the Hyades sing. It's a dismal landscape, low lead-colored clouds. There is a menace in the air. When the wind sighs there, it's dead. When it whispers, it seems to have dread secrets, but they're still unknowable. We see very little signs of life outside of the few characters in the play. The city is, to quote Chambers, immortal but dead. It's dim, it's full of melancholy. You know, that's pretty much it. You know, it's this dead city that sits on the shore of the Lake of Hali.
And Chambers, I could be wrong here, but Chambers borrowed some terms like Carcosa. That came from, was it a poem?
Yes.
By
Okay. Chambers takes Carcosa. He takes Holly from Bierce. Hyada the shepherd and an inhabitant of Carcosa. I mean, that's the where Chambers gets those from. And let me read a couple quotes from Bierce himself, just to give you the idea. I mean, here's what Chambers read, and I will argue that these became cornerstones in what he was building with King in Yellow. Bierce, in an inhabitant of Carcosa, says, "Over all the dismal landscape, a canopy of low, lead-colored clouds hung like a visible curse. In all this there was a menace and a portent, a hint of evil, an intimidation of doom, an intimation of doom. Bird, beast, and insect there were none. The wind sighed in the bare branches of the dead trees, and the gray grass bent to whisper its dread secrets to the earth. But no other sound nor motion broke the awful response of that dismal place." And then later, in an inhabitant of Carcosa, Bierce writes, "No signs of human life were anywhere visible nor audible. No rising smoke, no watchdogs bark, no lowering of cattle, no shouts of children at play. Nothing but that dismal burial place with its air of mystery and dread. Due to my own disordered brain, was I not becoming again delirious? There beyond human aid, was it not indeed all an illusion of my madness?" So here we have Carcosa. Here we have this dismal, dead landscape. And Bierce has his character thinning and becoming ghostly and wondering, is this an illusion of my madness? Those are key pieces in Chambers' King in Yellow. And that is all coming from Bierce. There are these, again, Chambers takes these pieces, these threads, and then Poe, and stuff from the Decadence and the Symbios, and he takes all these elements, and with them he threads the nest, which becomes his King in Yellow. But yeah, some of our key words, Hastur, Holly, Carcosa, they all come right from Bierce. As does the cosmic horror element that's in the King in Yellow. That cosmic horror element in the King in Yellow is the very one that's in Bierce. So Chambers just carries it along. We could actually argue that in the Chambers track, Bierce is the first piece, then Chambers, then Wagner, etc.
Now, since you're, the modern go-to King in Yellow guy, I'd like to hear, how did you personally, come across Chambers and his work, and what was the first story you read? And
back in the 60s, there were all kinds of inexpensive paperback horror anthologies, much like this one. Okay? Mm-hmm. Most of these guys were dead. I don't know if they even got paid for these stories. If they did, it was cheap. I had a couple blocks from me, had a next to new place. And there was a bookcase over in the corner. And oftentimes there were piles of books. So I would go in there and, 2 cents, 3 cents, 5 cents for a paperback. And I used to buy all these horror anthologies, as many as I could get my paws on. Well, once I was going to a friend's parents' camp, and we got up there on a Saturday afternoon, and there was a little reefer, and there was some booze, and we were playing the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield, and we were singing, and then everybody kind of passed out all afternoon. I woke up, it was dark. I was sitting at the edge of the Sacandaga Reservoir, right on the reservoir. The mist was beginning to rise up, and everybody else was passed out. So I went out on the front porch, and I began to look through one of the volumes. Here was a thing called The Yellow Sign by Robert Chambers. I opened it up, I started reading. There's a full moon, or damn near one. Probably wasn't full, but it was pretty close. The mist is rising off the water, and I read Chambers. You know, you could hear fish splash out, you know, in the water. Other than that, it was dead silent, because everybody was passed out inside. I was scared to death, creeped out to no end. So the next day, and I think what really got me, other than the story itself, is the very next day, we were somewhere, and one thing led to another conversationally, and I mentioned I had just read this great horror story, Robert W. Chambers, blah, 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 and someone who was not a member of our party said, "Oh, Chambers, he's a hometown boy." Hometown where? "Oh, right there. You guys are staying here. That's like 4 miles from here.
Wow.
That's where the Chambers ancestral home is." I'm like, "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen?" So here I was, reading Chambers. I could almost throw a rock in his backyard.
Wow.
And I became fascinated that this incredible story had been written by someone who was from my neck of the woods. You know, it wasn't somebody from Kansas or Florida or whatever. You know, here was a writer that just blew my socks off. And he was me. Now, I mean, you know what I mean? From where I live. So that's when I began to search for Chambers. You know, got home, got out of work one night, ran to the bus, got the bus home, made it to the library before it closed. Robert W. Chambers, please, 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 I love you, Robert W. Chambers. You know, checked out a copy of The King in Yellow, and I have never looked back.
You know, a coincidence like that, you know, it's almost as if you were chosen, you know.
You know, it's
chosen
funny.
to kind of be the guy carrying the torch these days.
Yeah, it's funny because I never wanted to write. I never expected I would do this. I didn't start writing till I was nearly 40. So it's odd, but again, you know, it was the fact that he was from where I was from. And I just love the stuff. The other thing, too, is Robert Bloch and Edgar Allan Poe had set me up for Chambers. My favorite Poe story is A Cask of Amontillado, and my second favorite is A Telltale Heart. Telltale Heart, we have an unreliable narrator. We see one face, but what's behind it? Bloch, I didn't know he was a Lovecraftian writer till later. I started reading Bloch, Jack the Ripper, Psycho. Again, here is this human face, but this face is a mask. What's behind that? I mean, Ed Gein might have looked normal to the people in town. When he went to buy a dozen eggs, "Oh, hi, Ed." Hey, you know, who knew what he was? So this mask, this facade that people wear, that has always intrigued me. And like I said, Poe set me up for that. Bloch set me up for that. I was big fans of both. When I got my paws on Chambers, it was like, wow. And, you know, so that's where I start.
And as big of the, you know, King in Yellow kind of like champion you've become, you know, I'm sure you've read a ton of, you know, anything related. And, you know, in your opinion, what makes, you know, good King in Yellow fiction? Like, what do you most look for in a quality, you know, King in Yellow story?
Okay, at the end of the day, I'm a reader. I started a reader. I will go out a reader. More than anything, well, since I got through my teens anyway, the number one thing that gets to me is voice. I'm really interested in new and interesting voices and in various forms of storytelling and conveying a narrative. So that's always the first thing that grabs me. Of course, ideas are central. When we're dealing with the King in Yellow, mystery is quintessential to me. Do not fill in the gaps. So that's pretty much it. Voice, the idea, and just, leaving a mystery there, letting me think about it. Pretty much Chambers, King in Yellow work is the same thing I look for in other work. Just related to Chambers in some capacity is all.
With there being so much out there now related to King in Yellow, for the readers out there who kind of want to add some of this yellow into their lives, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Bierce. As a matter of fact, let's do it this way. For a basic outside of the Chambers King in Yellow itself, which I've already said you can read online or on Kindle, that's the beginning, those 4 stories. Then, to look at the history of Chambers, Robert M. Price, I believe this was 98 or so, it's the Hastur cycle. This begins with Pierce. It has both of the Bierce stories. We go into Chambers. You get one of the Wagner stories, which is The River of Night's Dreaming. Then we get into Derelith. So we're tracking the history of the King in Yellow through its various incarnations, even when they become Derelithian. It has James Blish's More Light, wherein Blish actually writes the whole play. The Blish story is interesting, but I would call it a failure because, again, you can't write the play. Lynn Carter also writes the play in here. Many of the stories in Worthy's rehearsals for Oblivion are worthwhile. I would recommend this. And then we have A Season in Carcosa that I edited. Yes, I edited it. Yes, I'm biased. But I'm not a kind-hearted editor. You bring your A game, or what I think is your A game, or you don't get any time on the floor. Those things, as far as book-wise for core. If people want to pursue them individually, the 2 Bierce stories, Piety the Shepherd and Inhabiting Carcosa, before Chambers' core stories, Vincent Starrett's Casilda Song poem, both Wagner tales, The River of Night's Dreaming, and I've Come to Talk to You Again. Richard L. Tierney is one of our finest poets, and he has a King in Yellow poem called The Curse of the King. That is perhaps the finest King in Yellow poem ever written. Anne Schrader has a lot of King in Yellow poems. Every one of them is canon, and they are all in her Hippocampus poetry collection. Michael Sisko has a King in Yellow story called He Will Be There, which is in Secret Hours, his short story collection.
And that story is dedicated to you, I believe, right?
Yes, but don't let that fool you. That's not why it's canon.
No.
When I wanted to do the Palette Mask, I would bug Sisko all the time. Please write a King in Yellow story for me. Please. And Michael is generous and wonderful. He's a great guy. And he may have well wrote that just to shut Pulver up. But it's a great story. And his imagining of the king is Sisko. And you've read Cisco, so you know what I'm talking about. It's brilliant. John Tynes, who was heavily involved in gaming with Pagan Publishing. He has a couple of King in Yellow stories I would include in the canon. One is called Broad Alban, and another is called Ambrose.
Broad Alban, is that one in the Rehearsals for Oblivion?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And I would have used that in the Palette Mask. Like I said, there are 8 stories in Rehearsals for Oblivion that I would have used in the Palette Mask, which is what all these years later is a season in Carcosa, you know. I would include James Blish as his More Light as canon, because it's so interesting. I mean, the play cannot be written and it fails, but I include it as canon because of the attempt to do it. I don't believe an editor should be in their own book because they can't properly vet themselves. So I feel a little guilty saying this, but then again, I'll say it because I've been told this. My work, not all of it is canon, but I would say the majority of King in Yellow stories from Blood Will Have Its season are canon. Part of the reason I would say that is when I first read Carl Lee and Casilda at the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival, S.T. was in the audience sitting there with Willem Pugmire, and apparently a number of times during my reading he turned to Willem and said, "That's brilliant. My God, that's incredible." So S.T. has said some of these things that had very high praise for some of my King in Yellow work. Ella Datlow's been nice to some of my King in Yellow work. Jeffrey Thomas, the noted creator and writer of Punktown, has been very kind in his praise of my King in Yellow work. So I have a whole bunch, not like I said, not all of them, but I would say about half of my King in Yellow work winds up to be canon. I also have some honorable mentions. Things that for one reason or another don't make my canon list, but I think are worthy. And if someone really gets into the King in Yellow and is looking to expand a little bit, these are places to expand. Aaron Dembo has a story called Suicide Watch. Lynn Carter's poetic version of the play is The Tatters of the King. That's interesting. Thomas Ring actually wrote the complete play. Again, I don't think you can. It doesn't convey madness. It's interesting. If you're really into this, that's an interesting read. John Horner Jacobs has a novel called Southern Gods that has Hastur and King in Yellow elements. Again, I don't consider it canon, but it's a very enjoyable novel. You and I had recently talked about D.J. Tyer's The Yellow House, and I did read that today, and I would give that an honorable mention. And Sylvia Marino Garcia has a story called Flashflame, and I would also include that on my honorable mentions.
Yeah, I believe that one's in Book of Cthulhu, right? Is that where you can find that one?
Yes, it is.
I believe.
Yes. I'd also add that as much King in Yellow as I've read, and I desperately go out of my way to read everything. When I was reading for the Palette Mask, I read nearly 500,000 words. There is a lot of stuff out there, a lot of it unpublished, a lot of it is still unpublished. And I try to read everything because I don't know where the next gem is. So it's like Brian Keene has a King in Yellow story. I apologize, I don't know the name of it, but it's in one of his collections. I've never read it. It could be brilliant. It may not be canon to me. Keene is a very good writer, but I haven't read that. So this is my list. It's my opinion. You know, mileage will vary. And like I said, I'm sure there's some things out there that I just not have encountered. I encounter more than the normal person because all kinds of people go, "Oh, Joe, you're the King in Yellow. Did you hear about this? Did you hear about that?" And sometimes I get sent things, because somebody wants my stamp of approval. Well, you know how that goes. So
Yeah. So, what is the future for the King in Yellow right now? I mean, is there anything in the foreseeable future, that is happening?
Absolutely. First thing is next month, Lovecraft E-Zine, which is published by Mike Davis. It's free online Lovecraftian zine, which has always been friendly to King in Yellow stories, I might add. Next month, he's doing the Lovecraft E-Zine issue will be an all King in Yellow issue, which was guest edited by me. And I just got greenlit, not quite 2 weeks ago, a project I've been pursuing for a couple of years now, which is called Casilda Song. All the invitations have been sent out. Everyone's gotten back to me. I am very, very, very pleased with the response. Hell, I'm over the moon. And Casilda Song will be just like a season in Carcosa. All new tales based upon the King in Yellow or Carcosa in tribute to Robert Chambers. But this time around, they will all be written by women. Every single story. And the women who have agreed to submit is a staggering list to me. And let's face it, you and I have discussed this in the past. If we look at horror, weird fiction, whatever out there, at the talent pool that's currently there, the amount of women writing that are brilliant is staggering. Kathy Koja, Elizabeth Hand, Caitlin Kiernan, Gemma Files, who should be a national treasure. I don't care if she's Canadian. Amazing writer. I would not edit a book without going begging to her. Livia Llewellyn, her Engines of Desire from 2 years ago is one of the most devastating debuts ever. Molly Tanzer, the ladies who are working today and in the past too. We have had, so with Casilda Song, I really don't want any old boys school. In a season of Carcosa, I have a good number of women, and I want to expand that. Women are an important voice. They certainly have every ability that anybody else has. Plumbing does not have anything to do with one's abilities. So a season in Carcosa will be out next spring. It's already underway. I'm very close to having another season in Carcosa greenlit. So that would be the third part of all new stuff. I'm tinkering with an idea for a King in Yellow novel. I keep going back and forth. There's something in Chambers that no one's ever picked up on. No one that I know of. And I don't know why. It just screams. But, I haven't been playing with the long forms for a while, so we'll see. Of course, I have all these fantasies about a King in Yellow film. And currently I'm working on a treatment with a friend of mine for a King in Yellow feature film. Who knows how that'll go. It's in the beginning stages, but, we're having fun with it.
Hopefully it doesn't drive all your audience mad,
Well, as long as they paid for the ticket at the theater first, that's okay.
So, do you have any...
the other thing that I think the future is going to bring is we are absolutely, at some point, someone in Hollywood is going to make a King in Yellow feature film. because of the popularity of True Detective. And we are going to be inundated with King in Yellow fiction any minute now, especially due to the advent of, you can write a short story or a novel and put it up on Kindle, and, we're going to see so much stuff so quickly, it's going to be scary.
Yeah. Well, the King in Yellow and True Detective is interesting because even though the show stays in realist mode, its treatment of anytime it talks about, the King in Yellow or Carcosa, it keeps kind of that sense of mystery that you were talking about as essential to anything you would consider, canon.
Exactly. So far, True Detective has utilized the King in Yellow in a absolute strict Chambers fashion brilliantly. I can't praise the show enough. I don't want to give away spoilers or anything because I know a lot of people don't have HBO. I've even had people message me on Facebook. Do you know when the DVD box set's coming out? Well, no, I wish I did because I'm hoping there's a lot of extras, But we're going to absolutely be flooded in King in Yellow stuff by the end of the year, I suspect. I suspect we are also going to find other King in Yellow anthologies being produced. Another thing that is in the works that I'm aware of is S.T. Joshi via Centipede Press will be doing a 2-volume Robert Chambers collection. Much needed. And I get to write the foreword to that, which I'm looking forward to.
Centipede Press is wonderful.
One other King in Yellow thing I have coming is in September at, I think that's the World Fantasy Convention in England. Editor Nate Peterson's Starry Wisdom Library book will come out. And I had the great privilege to write the King in Yellow entry for that, which was one of the most difficult things I ever wrote. Because the Starry Wisdom Library is gone in 1877. So where does a play come that early? So digging around through all kinds of things to establish a provenance was not an easy task. But it was fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. So do you have any, out of all the authors out there that have never written any King in Yellow fiction, or there are a few that you have like a wish list, to see?
Yes, I do. Peter Straub. We know from the introduction to Carl Wagner's In a Lonely Place that he liked Wagner, that he liked the King in Yellow. Straub can do so many things so brilliantly. An unreliable narrator, madness, Straub can do that while he's having lunch. He's a mega talent. I would die to see what Peter Straub would do with the King in Yellow story. Elizabeth Hand is one of our finest writers. Long form, short form. The lady walks on water. Absolutely kill to see her take an examine the King in Yellow. And Caitlin Kiernan. I would die. The Red Tree is one of the most, what a brilliant piece of literature. And what an unbelievably unreliable narrator, perhaps the best one in recent memory. So, those three people, those would be my, please, please, please.
Hopefully they're going to watch this and, maybe.
Oh yeah, then they're gonna call me, right? And ironically, it's all kinds of people pick on Stephen King, and I think that's just jealousy because Stephen King is capable of hitting home runs. He's like Neil Young. This one might not have been too good, but be careful because his next at bat, he might hit it out of the park. And I would be really curious to see Stephen King take a look at Chambers.
I'm surprised he
if
hasn't,
pardon me.
I'm surprised he hasn't, really. I mean, he's done a few.
I don't.
Like
I'm sure he's aware of Chambers, but I don't know. Like I said, I know Straub is aware of Chambers. Of course, Straub is so talented and he has so many of his own ideas. Straub normally doesn't use other people's creations and tropes. But one time, it would be cool. Dear Mr. Straub, you're a genius. Please, I mean, I'll pay twice as much for the book. I will. He would do a magnificent job. I get so excited at the thought of Peter Straub and the King in Yellow. It's, makes me almost gleeful.
Is there anything, you'd like to leave those viewing, with?
Everybody who's watching True Detective, and coming to the King in Yellow because of that, we are blessed by this show. The weird fiction elements that are in the show add layers and layers to those of us who are lovers of horror and weird fiction. But even without knowing what those things are, this show is brilliant and perfect. So enjoy it. Those of you who are just discovering The King in Yellow and wondering what it is, or hearing that it actually is something that wasn't made up for this show, I hope you go exploring, and I hope you enjoy what you find as you explore, and that you, from there, seek out more weird fiction.
Well said. Season Carcosa was actually, the first book I reviewed when I started the Arkham Digest. It had just come out. So, it's fun seeing all the King in Yellow exposure. Well, thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate it. We'll talk again soon.